Something is terribly wrong. A quiet town, a respected family, a grandfather who suddenly becomes a man of secrets. What is happening behind those locked doors? Why did a woman leave behind a message begging for protection? Why is a young girl at the center of a mystery that no one dares to speak about? This story will take you into a world of hidden truths, buried betrayals, and shocking revelations. If you think you know what's happening, think again. Nothing is what it seems. Stay until the end, and you'll witness a truth so shocking it will change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. What do you think is the secret that no one is talking about? Now let's begin. The night was drowning in shadows. The rain hit the windshield in heavy sheets, distorting the yellow glow of the streetlights as Rebecca Hayes gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, her heartbeat thudding so hard in her ears that she barely heard the tires skidding against the slick pavement. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, but no matter how far she drove, she couldn't outrun the terror clawing at her chest. She glanced at the rearview mirror for the 10th time in less than a minute. The darkness behind her was thick, the kind that swallowed everything whole, but she swore she saw the faintest glimmer of headlights in the distance. Someone was following her. Someone had been following her since she left home. Her daughter, Lily, stirred in the back seat, her small voice breaking through the tense silence. "Mom, where are we going?" Rebecca forced her voice to stay calm. "It's okay, baby. Just go back to sleep." But her hands trembled against the wheel. She couldn't let Lily see her fear. She reached for her purse, fumbling blindly until her fingers found the crumpled piece of paper tucked inside. A name, a phone number, the only person she could trust. She had to get to him before it was too late. But was it already too late? Her breath caught as a pair of headlights appeared behind her. Closer now. Too close. A horn blared. Rebecca's stomach dropped as the car behind her accelerated, the engine roaring. Panic slammed into her ribs as she pressed her foot harder against the gas pedal. No, no, no. The tires skidded. The road curved sharply, but she wasn't fast enough, wasn't in control anymore. The last thing she heard was Lily's scream before the world spun into chaos. The car veered off the road. The trees came too fast. The sound of impact shattered the night. And then nothing. Silence. A faint drizzle fell over the wreckage. Smoke curled from the crumpled hood, rising into the cold air like a final whisper of a secret lost to the night. Rebecca's head lolled to the side, a thin line of blood trailing from her forehead. Her fingers, still clutching the piece of paper, slackened. Lily's cries pierced through the darkness. "Mommy!" But Rebecca didn't move. Hours later, the hospital room was bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. Machines beeped rhythmically, breaking the suffocating quiet. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, but nothing could erase the weight of tragedy pressing against the walls. Richard Hayes stood at the foot of the hospital bed, his shoulders rigid, his face unreadable. His daughter lay motionless, her skin too pale against the stark white sheets. The doctors had already given their verdict. The injuries were too severe. There was nothing left to do. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had always been a man of discipline, a man who commanded respect, but standing here now, staring at the lifeless body of his only child, he felt like a hollow shell of himself. A soft sniffle made him turn. Lily, the little girl, sat curled up in a chair, her knees pulled to her chest. Her dark curls framed her face, damp with tears, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. Richard stepped closer, his voice rough. "Lily!" She flinched. Pain flared in his chest. She was all he had left now, the only piece of Rebecca that remained. But she was afraid of him. He saw it in the way she kept her distance, in the way she clenched her tiny fists as if preparing for the worst. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand drop. "It's going to be okay," he said, but even he wasn't sure if that was true. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. A nurse peeked in, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hayes? There's someone here to see you." Richard stiffened. "Who?" The nurse hesitated before stepping aside. And then there he was, Daniel Carter. The room turned ice cold. Lily's head snapped up, her breath hitching. "Daddy!" But Richard was already moving, already stepping between them. "No!" His voice was steel. "You're not supposed to be here." Daniel's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He took a step forward, then stopped when Richard squared his shoulders. "I just want to see her," he said, his voice raw. Richard clenched his jaw. "You lost that right a long time ago." Daniel's gaze flickered to Lily, then back to him. "Rebecca called me." Silence. Richard felt the air shift. The world tilt slightly on its axis. "That's not possible." Daniel exhaled shakily. "She was scared, Richard. She told me something was wrong. She told me to come." The words hit like a fist to the gut, because deep down Richard knew. He had known something was wrong. He had felt it in the way Rebecca avoided his calls, in the way she had pulled away from him in the weeks leading up to the accident. He had convinced himself that she was just being dramatic, that she was overreacting. But now, his fingers curled into fists. "You need to leave." Daniel's eyes darkened. She was trying to protect Lily. She knew something. "Get out." Daniel hesitated, his shoulders tense. But one look at Lily and he knew he had no choice. With one final glance at his daughter, he turned and walked away. The door clicked shut behind him. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why can't I see Daddy?" Richard inhaled deeply, forcing his expression to stay neutral. "Because I'm the only one who can protect you now." Lily blinked, confusion flickering in her tear-streaked face. But she didn't argue. She just looked away, silent once more. Richard turned back to Rebecca's lifeless body, his throat tightening. If Daniel was telling the truth, if Rebecca really had called him for help, then what was she running from? And more importantly, who had been following her that night? As he stood there, a shiver crawled down his spine. Something wasn't right. And deep in his gut, Richard knew. This was just the beginning. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with the weight of something unspoken. The dim glow of the hospital corridor cast long shadows on the floor as Richard Hayes led Lily toward the exit. His grip firm but not forceful. She hadn't spoken since Daniel left. She just followed, her small frame wrapped in the oversized hospital blanket, her gaze downcast. Outside, the world seemed eerily quiet. The streetlights flickered, and a cold breeze cut through the night, making Lily shiver. Richard tightened his grip on her hand, his mind racing. Rebecca had been afraid of something before the accident. Daniel claimed she had reached out to him. But why? And why hadn't she called Richard instead? The drive home was silent. Lily pressed her forehead against the cold window, her breath fogging up the glass as she watched the dark streets blur past. Richard glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man who prided himself on control, on knowing exactly what needed to be done. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was grasping at shadows. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Richard hesitated before stepping out. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark, the air around it thick with memories. Rebecca had grown up here. This was supposed to be a place of safety. But tonight, it felt different. Lily didn't move at first. She just sat there, her fingers clutching the hem of her sleeve. Finally, she unbuckled her seatbelt and followed Richard inside. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Richard flipped on a light, the sudden glow revealing the neatly kept living room. Everything was exactly as he had left it that morning, except for the small pile of unopened mail on the table. He hadn't had the chance to go through it yet. Lily lingered near the doorway, her posture tense. "Mom always said this house was haunted," she murmured. Richard exhaled, forcing a small, tired smile. "That's just something she liked to say when she was little." Lily didn't look convinced. She rubbed her arms as if trying to shake off a chill. "Come on," Richard said, softening his tone. "Let's get you to bed." Lily hesitated before following him up the stairs. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with old photographs that Rebecca had once begged him to take down. "It's like living in a museum," she had said, laughing. But Richard had never been able to part with them. Now, as he passed them, they felt more like ghosts than memories. He pushed open the door to the guest room. The bed was made, the air slightly stale from being unused. "You'll sleep here for now," he said. "We'll figure everything else out later." Lily nodded, though her expression remained distant. She climbed onto the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Richard hesitated at the doorway. "If you need anything—" "I'm fine," she interrupted, turning her back to him. Richard exhaled, running a hand over his face. He wanted to say something, anything, to make this easier, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he turned off the light and closed the door. As he made his way back downstairs, his eyes landed on the pile of mail. He sorted through it absent-mindedly. Bills, advertisements, a few letters addressed to Rebecca. Then his fingers stopped. A small, crumpled envelope. No return address. Just his name written in rushed, uneven handwriting. Richard's pulse quickened as he carefully tore it open. A single sheet of paper fell into his hands. The message was short. "She was right to be afraid. You should be too." The air left his lungs. He read the words again, his fingers tightening around the paper. His gaze darted toward the front door, the windows, the darkened street outside. Someone had been here. Someone had left this. A sharp creak echoed from upstairs. Richard turned, his muscles tensing. He moved swiftly up the staircase, stopping outside Lily's room. The door was still closed. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. Silence, but something felt off. He turned the knob and pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Lily was curled up under the blanket, her breathing slow and steady. Everything was as it should be, except for one thing, the window. It was slightly open. Richard's stomach twisted. He was sure it had been closed when they arrived. He stepped inside, his pulse hammering, and shut it firmly. His eyes scanned the room, but nothing else seemed disturbed. Still, unease settled deep in his bones. He took one last glance at Lily before quietly closing the door. Downstairs, he locked every door, checked every window. He turned off the lights, leaving only the dim glow of the kitchen lamp. Then he sat at the table, staring at the letter, his mind a storm of questions. Who had written it? And more importantly, what exactly had Rebecca been afraid of? Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching. The night dragged on in unsettling silence. Richard Hayes sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming against the wood as his eyes remained locked on the crumpled letter before him. She was right to be afraid. You should be too. The words burned into his mind, looping endlessly like a whisper in the dark. Someone had been watching. Someone knew something. And Rebecca had been afraid of something long before her accident. The clock on the wall ticked methodically, but time felt frozen. Richard exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. His instincts screamed at him to call someone, to report the letter, but something held him back. Who would he even report it to? What would he say? That someone had left a vague, threatening note on his doorstep? That his daughter had died in an accident that might not have been an accident at all? That the man he had spent years keeping away from Lily was now claiming that Rebecca had reached out to him for help? No, he couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Not without proof. Instead, he stood abruptly, grabbing the letter and heading toward the fireplace in the living room. He couldn't risk Lily seeing it. She had already been through enough. He watched as the flames consumed the paper, curling its edges into blackened ash, until there was nothing left but embers. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Upstairs, the house was still. He climbed the steps quietly, his eyes flicking toward Lily's door as he passed. It remained closed. The small gap at the bottom showed no movement, no shifting of shadows. She was asleep. Good. His own room felt colder than usual. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing. His mind churned over every detail of the past few weeks, every conversation he had with Rebecca before she died. Had there been signs? Had she tried to tell him something and he hadn't been listening? His eyes drifted to the nightstand. A single framed photograph sat there. Rebecca at 16, grinning at the camera, her wild curls barely tamed, her eyes bright with a light that had long since dimmed. It was taken the summer before everything changed. Before she started keeping secrets. Before Eleanor died. A shudder crawled up his spine. It had been years since he had let himself think about his mother. She had been troubled, to say the least. Always muttering about things no one else could see. Always convinced that someone was watching, waiting. He had dismissed it as paranoia back then, as had everyone else. But now, sitting in the dark, the weight of the letter still heavy on his mind, he wasn't so sure. He laid back, staring at the ceiling, but sleep never came. By morning, the house felt just as heavy as the night before. The gray clouds outside pressed low against the horizon, threatening more rain. Richard moved through the kitchen in practiced routine, setting out a plate of toast and a glass of orange juice at the table. But he knew Lily wouldn't eat much. She appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She didn't say good morning. She just sat at the table, picking at the edge of her toast without taking a bite. Richard watched her carefully. "You didn't sleep well," he said finally. Lily shrugged. "I had a dream." His stomach tightened. "What kind of dream?" She hesitated, shifting in her chair. "I don't remember all of it. Just a voice. A woman's voice. She was whispering something, but I couldn't understand what she was saying." Richard's grip tightened around his coffee mug. "Did she look familiar?" Lily shook her head. "No, I didn't see her. Just heard her." She paused, then added in a quieter voice, "It felt real." Richard forced himself to stay calm. It was just a dream, nothing more. But still, unease coiled in his chest like a knot that refused to loosen. "Maybe it was your mom," he offered gently. "Sometimes dreams are just our minds trying to hold on to people we miss." Lily didn't respond. She just stared at her juice, as if the answer were hidden in the glass. The day passed slowly. Richard spent most of it in his study, trying to focus on paperwork, on bills, on anything that wasn't the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He ignored the way Lily kept glancing toward the window, ignored the way his own heartbeat quickened every time a car passed by the house too slowly. By evening, the rain had started again. A steady drizzle that turned the world outside into a blur of muted colors. Lily sat on the couch, flipping through an old picture book, but Richard could tell she wasn't really seeing it. "You okay?" he asked from his chair. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." But he knew she was lying. A knock at the door made them both jump. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs as he stood, moving toward the entryway. He peered through the peephole, his jaw tightening at the sight of the woman standing on the porch. Sarah Whitmore, Rebecca's childhood best friend. He hesitated before unlocking the door, pulling it open just enough to meet her eyes. "Sarah." She looked at him with something unreadable in her expression. "I need to talk to you." Richard glanced over his shoulder at Lily, who was watching from the couch. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The rain drizzled lightly over the porch. Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "I know you don't want me here, but I found something." Richard exhaled. "Sarah, now is not the time." She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small, worn notebook. "Rebecca's journal," she said, her voice edged with something close to desperation. "She was writing things down, Richard, about what was happening before the accident." Richard's stomach dropped. Sarah flipped through the pages, stopping at one near the end. She held it out to him. "Read it." His hands felt too stiff as he took the notebook, his eyes scanning the uneven scrawl of Rebecca's handwriting. "I know I sound crazy, but I swear someone is following me. I see them at the store, at the gas station. I keep feeling like I'm being watched. And Dad doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm overreacting. But I know what I saw. Someone is out there." The words blurred. His grip tightened on the pages. Sarah's voice was softer now. "She wasn't imagining it, Richard. Someone was watching her. And if she was right? She hesitated, her gaze locking onto his. Then maybe her accident wasn't an accident at all. The air between them felt suffocating. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent weeks convincing himself that Rebecca's death had been a tragedy, but nothing more. That the questions Daniel had raised were nothing but paranoia. But now, holding her words in his hands, he wasn't so sure anymore. Something was wrong. And for the first time, he realized maybe Rebecca had been right all along. The cold rain soaked through Richard's shirt, but he barely felt it. His fingers tightened around Rebecca's journal. The ink smudged in places from hurried writing. The pages creased from being handled too many times. He could still see her handwriting, the frantic loops and sharp edges of her words. I know I sound crazy, but I swear someone is following me. The letters seemed to pulse against the damp air, hammering at his skull, forcing him to acknowledge something he had been trying to push away. Sarah stood before him, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression lined with exhaustion. She wasn't paranoid, Richard. She was scared. Richard exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm, to think rationally, but his mind was spinning. He had spent weeks convincing himself that Rebecca's death had been nothing more than a tragic accident. But now every assumption, every certainty was unraveling. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Where did you find this? Sarah hesitated before answering, her fingers twitching at her sides. In her apartment. She kept it hidden in a box under the floorboards. Richard's breath caught. You went through her things? Sarah's jaw tightened. I had to. The police closed the case too quickly. No one asked the right questions. But Rebecca left something behind, Richard. She knew something was wrong. And if you don't start asking the right questions, then no one will. The weight of her words pressed against his chest, suffocating. He looked down at the journal again, flipping through the pages. Most of it was filled with mundane thoughts, notes about work, reminders about Lily. But then, the tone shifted. The handwriting became sloppier, the words more hurried. There was a man outside my apartment again. Same one I saw at the grocery store last week. He didn't come in, didn't say anything. Just stood there, watching. Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had dismissed her fears, chalked them up to stress, to exhaustion. Had he been wrong? A crack of thunder rumbled in the distance, and Sarah shifted on her feet. Look, I don't know what this means yet, but I know you, Richard. You don't ignore evidence. And this, she gestured toward the journal. This is evidence. Richard wanted to argue, wanted to push back, but the truth was, he had already begun to doubt everything. He nodded stiffly. I'll look into it. Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. Then, she hesitated. And Richard, if something happens, if you start seeing things that don't add up, you need to trust me. Richard didn't respond. He wasn't sure if he could. When she finally left, Richard stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the rain. His mind was a storm of questions. Who had been watching Rebecca? And more importantly, were they still watching now? Lily sat curled up on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, watching the raindrops slide down the window pane. The house was too quiet. It didn't feel like home. Not without her mom. She heard the front door close and turned her head as Richard stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. He looked different, tense, as if something had shifted in him. Lily pulled the blanket tighter around her. Who was that? Richard hesitated before answering. Sarah. Lily frowned. Mom's friend. Yeah. He moved toward the kitchen, setting the journal down on the counter before opening a cabinet. He didn't look at her as he spoke. She found something of your mom's. Lily's stomach twisted. What? Richard sighed, running a hand over his face. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Her journal. Lily's breath caught. She hadn't known her mother kept a journal. The thought made something ache in her chest. What did it say? Richard hesitated again. He didn't want to scare her, but he also didn't want to lie. She thought someone was following her. Lily's fingers tightened around the blanket. Was she right? Richard didn't answer. The silence stretched between them. Lily swallowed hard. Is that why she died? Richard flinched. The words hit him harder than they should have. He turned toward her fully now, his eyes softening. We don't know that. But we don't know she was wrong either, Lily murmured. Richard had no response to that. Instead, he moved toward the couch and sat down beside her. He wasn't sure how to comfort her. Wasn't even sure how to comfort himself. He had spent so long trying to shield her from the truth. But now the truth was clawing its way into their lives, whether he was ready for it or not. I'm going to figure this out, he said finally. I promise. Lily didn't say anything. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the rain outside. That night, the house felt heavier than before. Richard sat at his desk, Rebecca's journal open before him, his mind piecing together fragments of a story that no longer made sense. He reached for his phone, hesitating for a long moment before dialing. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Detective Simmons. Richard exhaled. I need to talk to you about my daughter's case. There was a pause. Then, I thought the case was closed. So did I. Richard ran a hand through his hair. But I think we might have missed something. The detective was silent for a moment. Then, meet me tomorrow. My office. We'll talk. Richard nodded, even though the detective couldn't see him. Yeah, okay. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His instincts were screaming at him that he was standing at the edge of something big, something dangerous. And for the first time in a long time, he was afraid. Lily couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face, saw her gripping the steering wheel, her eyes wide with fear, saw the headlights behind them getting closer and closer. She sat up, rubbing her arms. The room was too dark, the shadows stretching in strange ways. Then she heard it, a creak. Her breath caught. She turned her head slowly toward the window. It was open, just a crack. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Hadn't Richard locked it? She slid out of bed, her bare feet silent against the floor as she moved toward it. The night air was cold, sending a shiver down her spine. She reached out, gripping the edge of the window, about to close it. Then she saw it, a shape, standing at the edge of the yard. Watching, she froze. Her breath came fast and shallow. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its face hidden in the darkness. She stumbled back, her pulse roaring in her ears. Then, a whisper, too soft to make out the words. But she knew it was meant for her. A sob caught in her throat. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the floor as she darted down the hallway. Richard! His door flew open before she reached it. His face was sharp with alarm. Lily? What's wrong? She couldn't get the words out. She just pointed toward the window. Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest flashlight and rushed to her room. But when he looked outside, the yard was empty. The figure was gone. Only the faint echo of a whisper remained in the air. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows as Richard stood frozen at the edge of Lily's bedroom. His eyes scanned the yard, the flashlight beam cutting through the night, but there was nothing. No footprints in the damp grass, no lingering shadows, nothing to prove that anyone had been there at all. But Lily had seen something. Her small body trembled against him, her fingers gripping his sleeve so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath was shaky, uneven, her pulse a wild drum against his arm. Richard turned to her, kneeling to meet her frightened eyes. Tell me exactly what you saw. Lily hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window as if afraid the figure would reappear the moment she spoke. It was a man, I think, standing at the edge of the yard. He was just watching. Her voice wavered, and I think I heard him whisper something. Richard's stomach tightened. What did he say? Lily shook her head. I don't know. It was too quiet, but I felt it. Richard studied her for a long moment, his own pulse thrumming beneath his skin. Lily had no reason to lie, and after everything, the letter, Rebecca's journal, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, He couldn't ignore this. He stood, jaw tight, and walked to the window. He checked the lock twice, securing it firmly before drawing the curtains shut. "You're sleeping in my room tonight," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Lily didn't protest. Richard barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of possibilities. His instincts told him that something was wrong, but the logical part of his brain refused to accept it. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe Lily's fear had made her see things that weren't really there. Or maybe, he exhaled sharply, forcing himself up. The house was silent, save for Lily's slow, even breathing beside him. He glanced at the clock. 3:47 a.m. Too early. Too late. Richard swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing a hand over his face before reaching for his phone. He hesitated, staring at the screen, then scrolled through his contacts until he found the number. Detective Simmons. The call went straight to voicemail. Richard cursed under his breath, standing. He moved through the darkened house, checking the locks again. The front door, the back door, the windows, all secure. Still, the unease refused to leave him. He returned to his study, Rebecca's journal still open where he had left it. His fingers traced the words she had written, the frantic scrawl that spoke of paranoia, of fear. "I keep feeling like I'm being watched. I see him everywhere. I know I sound crazy, but I swear I'm not." Richard swallowed hard. He reached for his desk drawer, pulling it open. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old case files, was a worn leather notebook, his mother's. Eleanor Hayes had written pages upon pages of similar fears, of whispers in the dark, of figures lurking at the edge of her vision. He had dismissed her as paranoid, had assumed it was nothing more than a mind unraveling under the weight of time. But now, he wasn't so sure. A sharp knock at the door shattered his thoughts. Richard's head snapped up, his body immediately tensing. His first instinct was to check the time, 4:02 a.m. Too early for visitors. He moved carefully, his footsteps silent against the floor. He peered through the peephole, his muscles coiling like a drawn wire. A man stood on the porch. Richard didn't recognize him. His features were obscured by the hood of his rain-soaked jacket, but something about the way he stood, rigid, expectant, sent a chill down Richard's spine. He didn't open the door. Instead, he waited. The man knocked again. A beat passed, then another. Finally, the stranger took a step back, as if sensing that no one was going to answer. He lingered for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the night. Richard waited another full minute before unlocking the door and stepping onto the porch. The rain had started again, a steady drizzle misting the air. He scanned the empty street, his jaw tightening. Nothing, but something was left behind. A single envelope, damp from the rain, lay at his feet. Richard bent down, picking it up with steady hands. No name, no return address. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The image was grainy, black and white, but familiar. Then it hit him. It was his house, taken from a distance. From outside, his stomach lurched. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped the photo over. On the back, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were 4 words. "You are not alone." The breath left his lungs. Richard swallowed, his mind whirring, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been watching him, watching them. A sound from behind made him turn sharply. Lily stood at the edge of the hallway, her small frame silhouetted by the dim light. Her voice was small. Who was at the door? Richard hesitated. No one. Lily frowned, stepping closer. Then why do you look like that? Richard exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. He folded the photo, tucking it into his pocket before crouching to her level. It's nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. She stared at him, her gaze sharp for someone so young. You're lying. Richard didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, he forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's late. Let's go back to bed. Okay?" Lily didn't argue, but as she turned and walked away, Richard felt something settle deep in his gut. She didn't believe him, and honestly, he didn't believe himself either. The next morning was slow and heavy. The rain had finally stopped, but the clouds remained, hanging low over the town like a warning. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming against the wood. The photo lay in front of him. He had stared at it for so long that the image was burned into his mind. He had to do something. He reached for his phone, dialing Detective Simmons again. This time, the call went through. "Richard," Simmons answered, his voice gruff with sleep. "I need to see you," Richard said, wasting no time. Simmons sighed. "I told you the case is—" "This isn't about the case." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Someone was at my house last night. They left me a message. That got his attention." "Where are you now?" "Home." "Stay there. I'm on my way." Richard ended the call, exhaling slowly. His fingers brushed over the photograph again, his pulse steady but his mind racing. This was far from over, and for the first time he realized it was only just beginning. Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph as if it would somehow reveal its secrets if he looked long enough. The image was unsettling. His house captured from a distance, the darkness swallowing its edges, making it appear isolated, almost abandoned. But it wasn't the photograph itself that disturbed him. It was the message scrawled on the back in jagged, uneven letters. "You are not alone." The words burrowed into his mind, crawling under his skin. Someone had been watching him, watching them. Lily sat across from him, her small hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She hadn't touched it. She just stared at the steam curling into the cold morning air, her eyes distant. Richard forced himself to sound normal. "You feeling okay?" Lily nodded, but it was mechanical, like a movement she had rehearsed. She didn't look at him. Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Detective Simmons is coming over. He's gonna help figure this out." Lily finally lifted her gaze. "Do you think Mom knew who was watching her?" Richard hesitated. He wanted to lie, to say no, to tell her that it was just some misunderstanding, that things weren't as bad as they seemed. But he had already lied to her once, and she had seen right through him. "I don't know," he admitted. Lily studied him for a long moment before shifting in her chair. "I had another dream last night." Richard's stomach tightened. "The same one?" She shook her head. "No, this one was different. I was in the car with Mom. It was raining just like that night. But this time, she wasn't just driving. She was looking at me, talking to me." Lily hesitated. She said, "No matter what happens, don't trust." She stopped. Richard leaned forward. "Don't trust who?" Lily swallowed hard. "I don't know." The dream ended before she could say the name. A chill ran through Richard's spine. The coincidence was too much. First the journal, then the photograph. Now Lily's dreams, bringing back pieces of that night, as if they had been waiting in the dark to resurface. Before he could say anything else, there was a sharp knock at the door. Richard's muscles tensed. He stood slowly, setting the photograph down before walking toward the front door. He peered through the peephole out of habit, even though he knew who it was. Detective Simmons stood on the porch, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. Richard opened the door. Simmons stepped inside, shaking the rain from his sleeves. "You look like hell, Richard." "That makes two of us," Richard muttered, closing the door behind him. Simmons glanced around the house before his gaze landed on Lily, who was still sitting at the table. He gave her a nod. "Hey, kiddo." Lily nodded back but didn't speak. Simmons turned back to Richard. "All right, tell me everything." Richard led him to the kitchen, motioning toward the photograph. "Someone left this on my porch last night." Simmons picked it up, turning it over. His expression didn't change, but Richard knew him well enough to see the way his shoulders tensed slightly. "And you didn't see who left it?" "No, just a man standing on my porch. He knocked twice. then left before I opened the door. Simmons set the photo down. And you're sure this isn't just some prank? Richard leveled him with a look. You really think that's what this is? Simmons sighed, rubbing his forehead. No, I don't. He hesitated before continuing. I pulled Rebecca's case file last night. Richard's heart skipped a beat. And Simmons hesitated. The official report says the accident was caused by poor road conditions. Wet pavement, hydroplaning, the usual. But Richard's jaw clenched. But what? Simmons exhaled slowly. The forensics team noted something odd about the brakes. There was evidence of tampering. The room went silent. Richard stared at him. Tampering? Simmons nodded. It wasn't conclusive. The report was buried, marked as an inconclusive mechanical failure. But if you ask me, someone wanted that car to crash. Richard's pulse roared in his ears. He turned to Lily, who had gone completely still. Her fingers trembled slightly against the edge of her cup. She whispered, "Someone killed Mom?" Richard's throat tightened. "We don't know that yet." Simmons crossed his arms. "But we do know someone wanted to make sure she didn't make it home that night." The words sent a fresh wave of nausea through Richard's gut. Someone had been following Rebecca. She had been scared. She had been trying to reach out for help. And now there was proof that her car had been sabotaged. Simmons leaned forward. "Richard, I need you to be honest with me. Do you have any idea who might have wanted her dead?" Richard didn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know. But he was starting to suspect. That night, the house felt like a tomb. Richard sat in his study, Rebecca's journal open before him, the pages illuminated by the dim glow of his desk lamp. He traced his fingers over her words, searching for something he had missed. Lily was upstairs, but he doubted she was sleeping. Simmons had left hours ago, promising to dig deeper into the accident report. But Richard knew this was bigger than just a faulty investigation. This was deliberate. Someone had wanted Rebecca gone. His mind drifted back to the past, to his mother, to Eleanor Hayes, who had spent years whispering about people watching her, about things no one else could see, about how she knew something that had made her a threat. And then she was gone, just like Rebecca. His fingers curled into fists. A sound made him snap his head up. A creak. He turned sharply toward the doorway, his pulse hammering. Nothing. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He moved carefully into the hallway, his muscles coiled tight. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft. Indistinct. But it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the basement. Richard's breath caught. He hadn't been down there in weeks. He had barely set foot in that space since Rebecca left. But now something was waiting. He took a step forward. Then another. The door loomed ahead. The wood cool beneath his fingers as he slowly turned the knob. The stairs creaked under his weight. The air grew colder. And then he saw it. A small wooden box, sitting on the old workbench. It hadn't been there before. His hands shook as he reached for it, lifting the lid. Inside was a single tape recorder. And a note. "She tried to tell you." Richard's heart pounded. His fingers hovered over the play button. Then slowly he pressed it. The tape crackled to life. And Rebecca's voice filled the silence. "If you're hearing this, then I was right. Someone is following me. And I think I know why." The tape crackled, the static filling the basement like a low hum, vibrating in the cold air. Richard's breath hitched as he gripped the recorder tighter, his fingers slick with sweat. The voice on the tape, Rebecca's voice, was clear, but there was something in it, something raw, something terrified. "If you're hearing this, then I was right. Someone is following me, and I think I know why." The words clawed at his skin, forcing him into a reality he wasn't prepared for. His daughter had left behind a warning, a message meant for someone who would listen, but she hadn't given it to him. Why? The tape continued, Rebecca's breath audible between her sentences, uneven, rushed, like she had been recording it while looking over her shoulder. "It started a few months ago. The feeling. First, I thought it was nothing. Stress. But then I started seeing him. Not just once. Not just in passing. Every time I turned around. Every time I left work. Every time I picked up Lily from school. He was there. And now, I think he's closer than I thought. Richard's pulse pounded. The tape crackled again, and Rebecca's voice lowered, as if she were afraid someone else might hear. I thought it was just me. I thought maybe I was going crazy. But then I started digging, and I found something, Dad. Something I don't think I was supposed to see. Richard inhaled sharply, his grip on the recorder tightening. There were files in the city archives. Old ones. Records that didn't add up. Names that don't exist anymore. And when I tried to access them again, they were gone. Someone erased them. Someone is erasing everything. His stomach clenched. Rebecca had found something. Something connected to all of this. The car accident. The whispers. The photograph on his porch. The tape crackled again. I don't know who to trust anymore. But I know one thing. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. And if they come for Lily, you have to protect her, Dad. No matter what. Then silence. The tape stopped. Richard didn't move. His entire body felt like it had been submerged in ice. His daughter had left this message because she knew. She had known she was in danger. She had known someone wanted her gone. And now Richard knew it too. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. His entire life had been built around logic, around discipline, around the certainty that everything had an explanation. But there was no explanation for this. His fingers trembled as he rewound the tape, listening again, making sure he hadn't misheard. He hadn't. Every word was still there, every syllable pressing against his ribs like a fist. Rebecca had been trying to tell him something, and now it was up to him to figure out what. Lily was asleep when Richard finally made his way upstairs. He stood in the doorway, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, the way her small fingers clutched the edge of the blanket. She looked peaceful, but he knew better. She had seen the figure outside. She had heard the whispers. She knew something was wrong. Richard exhaled, stepping back, closing the door softly behind him. He moved through the dark house, every shadow stretching too far, every creak in the floorboards making his nerves coil. He needed answers. The files Rebecca had mentioned, city records, erased names, things she wasn't supposed to see. If they were gone, that meant someone had erased them. But records didn't just disappear completely, and Richard knew exactly where to start looking. The next morning was crisp, the sky a dull gray, the air heavy with something unsaid. Richard poured himself a coffee, his movements methodical, controlled. Across the table, Lily stirred her cereal without eating, her gaze distant. "You didn't sleep," Richard observed. Lily shrugged. "Neither did you." Richard didn't argue. He sat down, his eyes searching hers. "I need to go out for a bit. I won't be gone long." Lily frowned. "Where?" "Library," he said simply. "City archives." Her lips parted slightly, something flickering behind her eyes. "Because of Mom?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, "Can I come?" Richard's first instinct was to say no, to keep her away from all of this. But she was already in it. She had been in it from the beginning. He nodded. "All right." Lily pushed her cereal away, standing. "Let's go." The library smelled like dust and old paper, the air thick with something ancient and forgotten. Rows of shelves stretched toward the ceiling, lined with books and records, remnants of a city that had existed long before either of them. Richard led Lily toward the back, where the archive section sat, quiet and untouched. An old woman sat behind the counter, adjusting her glasses as she looked up. "Can I help you?" Richard gave a tight smile. "I need access to city records, property ownership, family registries, anything from about 25 years ago." The woman raised an eyebrow. "That's a specific request." "Family research," he said smoothly. She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Follow me." Richard and Lily followed her through a narrow aisle, past stacks of dusty files and locked cabinets. She gestured toward a small desk. Everything from the last 50 years is digitized. You can use that computer there. Richard nodded. Thank you. The woman left, and Richard sat, Lily pulling up a chair beside him. He logged in, fingers steady as he typed in the first name. Eleanor Hayes. The screen flickered. Then, no results found. Richard frowned. He typed it again. Same result. Lily leaned forward. Why isn't she there? Richard didn't answer. He typed another name. Rebecca Hayes. The screen loaded. A birth certificate. Marriage license. Public records. All intact. But Eleanor was gone. Like she had never existed at all. Richard's pulse quickened. He turned to Lily. Something's wrong. Lily swallowed. Mom said someone erased things. Richard exhaled slowly. His daughter had been right. Someone had erased Eleanor. Someone had wiped her from the records entirely. He turned back to the computer, his fingers moving faster. If her name was gone from public records, that meant there had to be something deeper, something hidden. He scrolled through old newspaper clippings, searching for anything. Any mention, any obituary, any trace that she had ever been here. And then he found it. A single article. Faded, nearly unreadable. But there. The headline sent a chill through his bones. Local woman declared missing under suspicious circumstances. Richard's blood turned cold. Lily peered over his shoulder. What does that mean? Richard's voice was hoarse. It means my mother didn't just disappear. Someone made her disappear. Lily's breath hitched. Like Mom. Richard couldn't answer, because he was starting to realize this had never been about just Rebecca. This had started a long, long time ago, and now it was coming back for them. Richard's fingers hovered over the faded article on the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The words felt like they had been etched into his skin, each letter a wound, each sentence a weight pressing down on his lungs. Local woman declared missing under suspicious circumstances. Eleanor Hayes, his mother, the woman who had spent years whispering about being watched, about people erasing things, about secrets buried so deep no one would ever find them. And now here she was, a ghost in the archives. Lily shifted beside him, her breath shallow, her small fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Dad. Her voice was quiet, uncertain. What does it mean? Richard swallowed, trying to find the words. It means she didn't just die, Lily. It means she disappeared. Lily frowned. Like Mom. The question lodged itself deep in Richard's chest. He didn't answer, didn't know how to. Instead, he clicked on the article, watching as the faded text expanded across the screen. March 27, 1995, Eleanor Hayes, a longtime resident of Blackwood, was officially declared missing this past week after failing to appear for a scheduled court hearing. Hayes, who had been making allegations regarding misconduct within city officials, had reportedly been seen exhibiting signs of paranoia in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Authorities suspect mental health issues may have contributed to her departure, though no official statement has been made. The words blurred. A scheduled court hearing. Misconduct within city officials. His mother had been trying to expose something. Richard inhaled sharply, his mind racing. The similarities between Eleanor and Rebecca weren't just coincidences anymore. His mother had been afraid just like Rebecca had been. She had tried to tell someone, and then she was gone. Lily shifted again. She tried to say something, she murmured, her gaze locked on the screen. And they erased her. Richard clenched his jaw. Yeah. His fingers moved quickly, scrolling through the archives, searching for anything else, any mention of his mother beyond this article. But there was nothing. No follow-up reports. No investigation. No obituary. She had vanished, like she had never existed at all. Richard exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't over. Not even close. He turned to Lily. Come on. We're leaving. Lily blinked. Where are we going? Richard grabbed his coat. To see someone who might still remember. The car ride was silent. Lily sat curled up in the passenger seat, watching the rain streak down the windows, her fingers tracing patterns in the fogged-up glass. Richard kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his mind a tangle of questions. They drove past familiar streets, past houses that hadn't changed in decades. The town felt smaller now, like the weight of its secrets had shrunk it down, pressing it into something suffocating. Finally, they arrived. The house stood at the edge of town, nestled between old oak trees, its white paint chipped and peeling. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. But Richard knew someone was inside. Sarah Whitmore, Rebecca's childhood best friend. The only person who might still know what Rebecca had been looking for before she died. He stepped out of the car, motioning for Lily to stay put. She didn't argue. She just hugged her arms around herself, her eyes flickering toward the house. Richard walked up the steps, knocking firmly on the door. A pause. Then, footsteps. The door opened just enough for Sarah to peek out, her gaze narrowing. Richard. Richard exhaled. I need to talk to you. Sarah hesitated. Then, she opened the door wider. Come in. The inside of the house smelled like old books and cinnamon. A strange mix of warmth and something forgotten. The walls were lined with photographs. Rebecca as a child, Sarah standing beside her, smiling, their arms thrown around each other like sisters. Richard swallowed down the lump in his throat. Sarah led him into the living room, motioning for him to sit. You look like hell, she said, crossing her arms. You've said that before, Richard muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then, softer, what's going on? Richard exhaled, pulling the folded printout from his pocket. The article about Eleanor. He handed it to her. You knew my mother. What do you remember about the time before she disappeared? Sarah frowned, taking the paper. Her eyes scanned the text, and Richard didn't miss the way her fingers trembled slightly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she was afraid. Richard's chest tightened. Of what? Sarah hesitated, shifting in her seat. I don't know exactly. She never told me directly, but I remember she was trying to get people to listen. Kept saying she had proof of something, that she was going to court. But then, she disappeared. Richard finished for her. Sarah nodded. Yeah. She exhaled. She told Rebecca something once. Something that really shook her up. I don't know what it was. But after that, Rebecca started asking questions too. Richard's pulse quickened. What kind of questions? Sarah shook her head. She never told me. She just said she had to find answers, that she had to protect Lily. Richard inhaled sharply, leaning forward. Sarah, if Eleanor was investigating something and Rebecca started digging into the same thing, then that means Rebecca's death wasn't an accident. Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The words sat between them, heavy and unmoving. Sarah swallowed hard. Richard, what if Eleanor and Rebecca were trying to expose the same thing? What if someone didn't want them to? Richard clenched his jaw. Then that means whoever erased Eleanor. They're still here, Sarah whispered. A chill crawled down Richard's spine. The truth wasn't buried. It was waiting, and now it was watching them. By the time Richard and Lily left Sarah's house, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick with something unspoken. Lily sat quietly in the car, staring at her hands. Dad. Richard glanced at her. Yeah. Lily hesitated. If Mom knew the truth, why didn't she tell you? Richard's grip tightened on the wheel. I don't know, but deep down he was starting to understand. Rebecca hadn't told him because she didn't trust him with it. She had been afraid of something, and now Richard was afraid too. As he turned onto their street, his stomach clenched. Car was parked near their house. An unfamiliar car. Richard's pulse quickened. He pulled into the driveway, his eyes locked on the vehicle. The windows were tinted. No movement inside. Lily shifted beside him. Dad? Who is that? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the door handle, his breath slow and steady. Then, the car engine roared to life. The tires screeched against the pavement as the vehicle peeled away, disappearing down the street before Richard could get a look at the driver. Silence. Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "They're watching us." Richard exhaled, his hands tightening into fists. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." And for the first time, he realized they were running out of time. The night air was thick with tension, pressing against the windows like an unseen force. Richard stood by the living room window, his fingers resting lightly against the curtain as he peered outside. The street was quiet now, the unfamiliar car long gone, but the weight of its presence still lingered. Lily sat on the couch, curled up with a blanket, her gaze distant. She hadn't spoken much since they left Sarah's house. Richard knew she was processing everything, just like he was. He turned from the window, exhaling slowly. "We can't stay here." Lily looked up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Richard ran a hand through his hair. "Someone was outside our house tonight, watching us. And if they know we're looking into this, they'll try to stop us." Lily finished, her voice small but certain. Richard swallowed hard. She shouldn't have to know this. Shouldn't have to understand the way fear twisted in his chest like a vice. But she did. She had been living it just as much as he had. "We're leaving," Richard said firmly. "Tonight." Lily hesitated. "Where will we go?" Richard had already thought of that. There was only one place left. One place that might still hold the answers Rebecca had been searching for. "The old house," he said. Lily's face paled. "Grandma Eleanor's house?" Richard nodded. Lily hugged her arms around herself. "But it's abandoned." "I know," Richard said. "But if your mom found something, if Eleanor left behind anything." He took a breath. "That's where it'll be." Lily didn't argue. She just nodded, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Richard moved quickly, packing a small bag with essentials. They wouldn't be gone long. Just enough to search the house, to find whatever it was that had gotten both Eleanor and Rebecca killed. His hands trembled slightly as he grabbed his car keys. The truth was finally within reach. But something in his gut told him they might not be ready for it. The drive to the house was eerily quiet. The road stretched ahead in an endless black ribbon, the trees lining either side casting long shadows against the pavement. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path forward, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in behind them. Lily sat beside him, staring out the window. "I don't remember much about Grandma Eleanor," she admitted softly. Richard tightened his grip on the wheel. "You were young when she disappeared. Did you?" Lily asked. Richard hesitated. "Did I what? Did you believe her? When she said someone was watching her?" The question hit harder than he expected. He let out a slow breath. "No," he admitted. "I thought she was paranoid, that she was making things up in her head." Lily was quiet for a moment. "And now," Richard's jaw clenched. "Now I think I was wrong." The house loomed ahead, barely visible against the night sky. It stood at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown trees and vines that had begun to claim its walls. The paint was peeling, the windows dark, but the structure itself was still standing, waiting. Richard pulled the car to a stop, his stomach twisting as he stared at the house. He hadn't been here in years, not since Eleanor vanished. Lily shifted beside him. "It feels different." Richard nodded. "Yeah." He grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment before stepping out. The night was silent, unnervingly so. Not even the usual sounds of crickets or rustling leaves. Just stillness. Lily stayed close to his side as they approached the house. The front door was locked, but Richard still had the old key. He hesitated for a brief second before sliding it into the lock and turning. The door creaked open. Dust filled the air, the scent of decay and abandonment settling deep in his lungs. The living room was exactly as he remembered. Furniture covered in white sheets, photographs still hanging on the walls, frozen in time. Lily's footsteps were light against the wooden floor. "Do you think she left something here?" Richard moved toward the staircase. "We're about to find out." They searched for hours. Richard combed through every drawer, every cabinet, every crevice of the house that could possibly hold a secret. Lily checked the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines, searching for anything out of place. But there was nothing. No hidden documents, no journals, no evidence that Eleanor had ever kept a record of what she knew. Richard's frustration grew. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. It has to be here. Lily sat on the edge of the old couch, her fingers tracing the dust-covered fabric. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Richard frowned. What do you mean? Lily hesitated, then looked up at him. Mom said someone erased things, but they couldn't have erased everything. What if Grandma hid something in a place no one would think to check? Richard's pulse quickened. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the floors, the furniture. Then he saw it. The old piano. It sat in the corner, untouched, its surface coated in dust. Eleanor had loved that piano. She used to play it every night, the music drifting through the house like a lullaby. Richard moved toward it slowly. His fingers brushed against the keys, sending a soft, hollow note into the silence. And then, a click. Lily's breath hitched. Dad! Richard's heart pounded as he reached beneath the piano lid, his fingers searching. And then he found it, a small, hidden compartment. His breath caught as he pried it open. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age, the edges curling. Richard swallowed hard as he pulled it out, his hands shaking. He turned it over, his stomach twisting at the name scrawled across the front. Eleanor Hayes. Lily stepped closer. What does it say? Richard carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was messy, hurried, the ink smudged in places. Richard's eyes moved over the words, his pulse hammering. If you're reading this, then I was right. They're trying to erase me. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need someone to know the truth. There's something buried in this town, something they don't want anyone to find. And if they took me, they'll come for Rebecca next. Richard's breath left his lungs. Lily clutched his arm. She knew. Richard scanned the letter, searching for more, for something that would tell him what Eleanor had found. And then, at the very bottom, there was a name, a single name, one that sent a shockwave through his body. A name he recognized, a name that changed everything. Richard's hands trembled as he whispered it aloud. Detective Simmons. The room spun. Lily's grip on his arm tightened. Dad, what does that mean? Richard couldn't answer, because now he finally understood. The person they had been trusting, the person who had been helping them. He was the one who had been covering everything up. And now, he knew they had figured it out. The name burned in Richard's mind like a brand. Detective Simmons. It didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. Simmons had been his friend, his ally, the only person in the police department who had agreed to help reopen Rebecca's case, who had listened when Richard said something wasn't right. And yet, Eleanor's letter. If you're reading this, then I was right. They're trying to erase me. And if they took me, they'll come for Rebecca next. The weight of those words pressed down on his chest like a crushing force. He sat frozen on the dusty wooden floor of Eleanor's abandoned house, the yellowed letter trembling in his hands. Lily was beside him, her breath shallow, her small fingers digging into the fabric of his sleeve. Dad, she whispered, her voice tight. What do we do? Richard inhaled sharply, his mind racing. We leave. Now. Lily hesitated. But. No buts, Lily. If Simmons is involved in this, then we are not safe. His voice was low, urgent. We need to get out of here before he realizes we found this. Lily nodded, swallowing hard. Richard folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside his jacket before grabbing her hand. His muscles were tight with tension as he pulled her up, his ears straining against the silence of the house. They had been here for hours, too long. If someone had been watching them, if Simmons knew they were digging too deep, a shiver ran down Richard's spine. They had to move. Now, the night air was thick with humidity as they stepped onto the porch. The gravel driveway stretched ahead, the car waiting like a beacon in the darkness. Richard placed a firm hand on Lily's back, guiding her quickly down the steps. Stay close to me. Lily didn't argue. She could feel the shift in his energy, The way his movements had become sharper, more urgent. They reached the car. Richard yanked open the driver's side door, ushering Lily inside before sliding in himself. He jammed the key into the ignition, his heart hammering. Then, a light, a single pair of headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. Richard's breath stalled. The car sat there, unmoving, the beams cutting through the darkness like twin knives. Lily gripped the edge of her seat. "Dad!" Richard didn't hesitate. He threw the car into reverse, the tires skidding against the loose gravel as he spun the wheel, turning them back toward the road. The other car didn't move at first. Then, as if it had been waiting, the engine roared to life, and it followed. The road stretched ahead in an endless ribbon of asphalt, swallowed by the looming trees on either side. The headlights behind them burned in the rearview mirror, too close, too steady. Richard's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles white. "Hold on." Lily braced herself as the car picked up speed. The trees blurred past, the engine humming beneath them, but no matter how fast Richard drove, the car behind them stayed close. Too close. His mind raced. Simmons. It had to be Simmons. He knew they had found something. He knew they were getting too close. A sharp curve in the road loomed ahead. Richard turned the wheel, his muscles tight with control as the car skidded slightly before righting itself. The headlights behind them didn't waver. Lily's breath came fast. "Dad, what do we do?" Richard's eyes flickered to the side mirror. The car was gaining. He couldn't take them home. If Simmons was behind them, going home would be a death sentence. Instead, he made a split-second decision. He veered left, onto an old service road leading toward the outskirts of town. The headlights followed. Richard's pulse roared in his ears. This road was narrow, winding, dangerous at high speeds, but that's exactly why he had chosen it. If he could lose them in the turns, if he could get just enough distance. The car behind them surged forward. Lily cried out as the vehicle slammed into their bumper. The impact sent their car jerking forward, the tires screeching against the gravel. Richard clenched his teeth. He had been in high-speed chases before. He knew how to handle this. But this wasn't just him. This was Lily, and he couldn't risk her. Another impact. Harder this time. The rear tires lifted slightly before slamming back onto the road. Lily gasped. "Dad!" Richard's mind worked fast. He had one option left. Up ahead, the road split, one path leading further into the woods, the other sloping downward toward an old industrial site. Richard made his choice. He turned sharply, taking the downhill path. The car lurched, the slope pulling them faster than he anticipated. He gripped the wheel, guiding the vehicle down as smoothly as he could, his heart slamming against his ribs. The headlights behind them disappeared. For a brief, terrifying moment, Richard thought they had lost control. Then, a crash. A sharp, deafening impact from behind. And then silence. The world tilted. Richard's breath came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred as he forced himself to focus. "Lily," he choked out. She was shaking, her fingers gripping the dashboard. But she was okay. Richard exhaled, his mind spinning. The other car, it had lost control. Crashed somewhere up the hill. They had a chance. "We have to move," he said, forcing his door open. Lily followed, her breath uneven. "Where are we going?" Richard scanned their surroundings. The industrial site was mostly abandoned, the skeletal remains of old factories looming in the distance. Perfect place to disappear. "Come on," he urged. They ran. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rust and damp earth. Richard's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving. They didn't have much time. If Simmons was in that car, if he survived, he wouldn't stop. And if Simmons wasn't alone, Richard clenched his jaw. They needed a plan. Fast. Up ahead, a warehouse stood partially open, its metal doors rusted and hanging at odd angles. It was their only option. "Inside," Richard said, guiding Lily toward the entrance. They slipped inside, the air cool and stale. The space was vast, filled with old equipment, dust-coated crates, and remnants of a past long forgotten. Richard pressed a hand to Lily's shoulder. Stay low. Stay quiet. She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. They crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets, Richard's mind racing. Footsteps. Distant. Slow. Lily's fingers curled into his sleeve. Richard held his breath. Then, a voice. Low. Calm. Too calm. You should have stayed out of this, Richard. His blood ran cold. Simmons. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty space. Richard's pulse thundered. You really think you can run? Simmons continued, his voice drawing closer. You think this ends with you finding a letter? A pause. Then, I told you to trust me. Richard's jaw clenched. Everything, every doubt, every whisper, every piece of the puzzle had led to this moment. And now there was no turning back. He shifted slightly, his breath steady. He had spent his entire life believing in justice. But now he was facing the truth. And the truth was, justice had never been real. Not here. Not for Eleanor. Not for Rebecca. And maybe not for him. The warehouse was silent, but it was the kind of silence that suffocated. The kind that pressed in from all sides, thick and inescapable. Richard could hear his own breath, sharp and controlled. Could hear Lily's too, shallow and uneven as she clutched his sleeve with trembling fingers. The footsteps moved closer, slow and deliberate, each step echoing against the concrete floor like a countdown. You really think this ends with you finding a letter? Simmons' voice was calm, almost amused. You think you're the first one who tried to dig into this? Richard didn't move. He could see Simmons now, a shadow in the dim light, his stance relaxed but his presence towering. This wasn't a man caught off guard. This was a man who had been expecting this moment. You knew, Richard said quietly, his voice edged with something raw. You knew about Rebecca, about Eleanor, about all of it. Simmons tilted his head slightly, as if considering the weight of the accusation. Then he sighed, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? His voice dropped lower. I didn't kill your wife, Richard. I tried to help her, just like I tried to help Eleanor. Richard's grip tightened at his sides. Help them? He nearly laughed, but there was no humor in it, only something jagged and broken. You call this help? Simmons took a step closer. Do you know what happens to people who ask too many questions in this town? Richard didn't answer. Simmons exhaled, running a hand over his face. I did what I could. I tried to warn them. I tried to tell Eleanor to stop, but she wouldn't listen. His eyes darkened. Neither did Rebecca. Lily tensed beside Richard, her fingers digging into his arm. You erased them, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Simmons studied him for a moment before shaking his head. No, I didn't erase them, Richard. I just watched it happen. His gaze flickered toward Lily, his expression unreadable. And now you've put her in the middle of it too. Richard's body went rigid. He moved slightly, positioning himself between Simmons and Lily, his stance protective, unwavering. Simmons sighed. You really don't get it, do you? He took another step closer. This isn't about you. It was never about you. It was about what Eleanor knew, about what Rebecca found, about the names they weren't supposed to see, the connections they weren't supposed to make. Richard's pulse pounded. What names? Simmons smirked, but there was no warmth in it. The kind that don't go in newspapers. The kind that don't exist on paper at all. He tilted his head slightly. You ever wonder why Eleanor disappeared without a trace? Why there was no investigation? No body? No evidence? Richard's jaw clenched. Because she was erased, Simmons continued. The same way Rebecca was. Lily inhaled sharply. Then Mom didn't die in an accident, Simmons finished for her. No, she didn't. Richard felt something crack inside him. Who? His voice was sharp, desperate. Who did this? Simmons hesitated, his gaze flickering, his stance shifting slightly. For the first time, Richard saw it. Doubt, uncertainty, fear. And then, Simmons said something that made Richard's blood turn to ice. You already know who. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Richard's stomach twisted. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. But he did know. He had known for a while now. He just hadn't wanted to believe it. Simmons exhaled. "I tried to protect you, Richard. I really did. But you didn't stop. And now they know." A shiver ran down Richard's spine. "Who?" Simmons' eyes darkened. "The same people who made Eleanor disappear. The same people who silenced Rebecca. The same people who decide who stays and who vanishes in this town." His voice lowered. "And now they're coming for you too." The air felt thin. Richard swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had spent his life believing in justice, in rules, in order. But now he realized none of it had ever been real. Not here. Not for him. Not for Rebecca. Not for Eleanor. And now not for Lily. Richard took a slow step forward. "I'm not running." Simmons sighed. "Then you're a fool." A pause. Then a sound. Outside. The distant roar of an approaching engine. Simmons tensed. "They're here." Lily's breath hitched. Richard's pulse pounded. He had no time left. And he had only one choice to make. The warehouse door rattled as the sound of tires skidding against pavement filled the air. Richard grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her toward the far end of the building, his mind whirring. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Lily didn't argue. Simmons watched them, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, "You need to go." Richard froze. Simmons inhaled sharply. "You have 5 seconds before that door opens." Richard stared at him. "Why are you helping us?" Simmons' jaw tightened. "Because I failed them." His voice was hoarse. "Eleanor, Rebecca." I stood back and watched them disappear. "And now," he swallowed, "I won't make the same mistake again." The door creaked. Richard's chest tightened. Simmons nodded toward the back exit. "Go. Now." Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lily's hand and ran. The back door was rusted, barely hanging on its hinges. Richard forced it open, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Footsteps, shouts, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Richard pulled Lily toward the trees, his heart hammering. They had seconds. Just seconds. Lily stumbled slightly, but he caught her, gripping her hand tighter. "Keep going," he urged. They ran. Through the trees. Through the darkness. Through the town that had never been safe. Through the lies that had been woven around them for years. And as they disappeared into the shadows, Richard knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, he knew exactly what he had to do. He had to end it. For Eleanor. For Rebecca. For Lily. For good. The night swallowed them whole. Richard gripped Lily's hand as they ran, the damp leaves crunching beneath their feet, the cold air slicing against their skin. The trees stretched tall and endless, their branches clawing at the sky, their shadows stretching across the dirt like skeletal fingers. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams of artificial light slicing between the trees. They weren't far enough. Not yet. Richard's mind raced. Where could they go? His pulse pounded. Simmons had given them a chance, had told them to run. But now Richard wasn't sure if they could escape. Not this time. Lily stumbled. He caught her, his grip tightening. "Just a little farther," he whispered. "We're almost there." "Where?" Lily gasped. Richard didn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know. They just had to keep going. The woods stretched ahead, endless and unfamiliar. But then, through the trees, he saw it. An old cabin, barely standing, its roof sagging, its windows broken. It was nothing more than a relic, forgotten by time. But it was shelter. He pulled Lily forward. Inside. Now. They rushed toward the door, Richard forcing it open with a creak. The inside was worse than he expected. Dust-coated furniture, walls cracked from years of neglect. But it would have to do. He shut the door behind them, his breath ragged. Lily stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. "Dad, what do we do?" Richard swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Footsteps outside. Closer. Lily stiffened, her eyes wide with fear. Richard motioned for her to stay silent. The voices were right outside now. Low, hushed, methodical. Richard clenched his jaw. Think. Then, crash. The door burst open. Lily screamed. Richard moved on instinct, pulling her behind him as the figures stormed inside. The flashlights blinded him for a split second, but then he saw them. Men in dark suits, unfamiliar faces, but then one that wasn't. Detective Simmons. Richard's stomach twisted. You said you were helping us. His voice was edged with betrayal, his hands curling into fists. Simmons' expression was unreadable. I did help you. I gave you a head start. His gaze flickered toward the men behind him. But you should have kept running. Lily's breath came in shaky gasps. Richard stepped forward, his voice low, sharp. Who are they? Simmons exhaled. The people who make sure the truth never comes out. Richard's chest tightened. You told me to trust you. Simmons didn't flinch. And you did. That's why you're still alive. The men stepped closer. One of them, older, his face lined with experience, spoke first. Mr. Hayes, we need to have a conversation. Richard clenched his jaw. I have nothing to say to you. The man tilted his head. You misunderstand. You don't have a choice. Silence. Then Lily's small voice broke it. Did you kill my mom? The room went still. The older man's expression didn't change. Your mother was very persistent. She asked too many questions. Richard saw red. He lunged. Simmons moved fast, grabbing his arm before he could reach the man. Don't, he warned. You'll only make it worse. Richard's entire body trembled with rage, but Simmons' grip was ironclad. The older man sighed. We didn't want it to end like this, Richard. You could have left it alone. But now you've forced our hand. Richard's pulse roared. If you touch Lily, the man raised a hand. We're not monsters. Richard almost laughed at the audacity of it. Not monsters. After everything, the man continued, his voice measured. You have two choices, Mr. Hayes. You take your daughter, you leave this town, and you never look back. Or, his gaze darkened. You both disappear. Lily's fingers dug into Richard's sleeve. The air was suffocating. Richard exhaled slowly. If I leave, what happens to Eleanor's story? To Rebecca's story? The man shrugged. They'll fade, like they were supposed to. Richard's jaw clenched. You're just going to bury everything? That's what we do, the man said simply. A pause. Then, Simmons. His voice was quiet, uncertain. What if we don't? The room shifted. The older man turned. Excuse me? Simmons inhaled sharply. What if we don't bury it? He glanced at Richard. What if we let the truth out? Richard's breath caught. The older man studied Simmons. You're not serious. Simmons swallowed hard. I've been covering for you for years. I've watched too many people disappear. I've done things I can't undo. But this, he glanced at Lily. This is different. Richard saw it. The shift, the doubt. Simmons was breaking. The older man's face darkened. Careful, Simmons. Simmons exhaled. No, you be careful. Because I think you underestimated how much Richard is willing to fight. His gaze flickered. And how much I am. Silence. Then, a movement. Fast. Simmons grabbed his gun. Richard moved at the same time. Chaos erupted. The older man shouted. One of the others lunged. A shot fired, loud and deafening. Lily screamed. Richard grabbed her, shielding her as the room exploded into movement. Simmons shoved one of the men aside, turning to Richard. Run! Richard didn't hesitate. He pulled Lily toward the back door, kicking it open. The night air hit them like a slap, cold and sharp. Behind them, more shouting, more gunfire. But Richard didn't stop. They ran. Through the woods, through the darkness, through the lies and the history that had tried to bury them. And finally, they reached the road. Headlights in the distance. A car. Richard's chest heaved as he waved his arms, his mind screaming for help. The vehicle slowed. Sarah Whitmore. She threw open the door. Get in. Richard didn't ask questions. He lifted Lily inside, sliding in after her. Sarah slammed the gas. The car roared forward. And just like that, they were gone. The town faded behind them. Richard exhaled shakily, his grip tight on Lily. Sarah's voice was breathless. What the hell just happened? Richard swallowed hard. The truth came out. Lily's fingers curled into his sleeve. Did we win? Richard hesitated. Then, softly, we survived. Silence. Then, from the back seat, Lily whispered, so did Mom and Grandma Eleanor. Richard turned to her. She looked out the window, her face unreadable. But her eyes, they were steady, determined. She knew, even if the world tried to erase them, they would never be forgotten.